Well, I hope everybody's got their pens and paper and kind of sitting back comfortable now. And I want to continue on with our first segment in this series. And without getting into any real technicalities, I want to give everyone a brief outline of the history of the island of Hispaniola and how it's separated into two different countries. And we hope this gives you an idea of why the DR has such a vast variety of cultures within itself. Okay, we're going to set up here and start with a pre-Spanish history. And there was a series of waves of people called Arawaks. They were migrants, and they moved in from the Orinoco Delta, which is in South America. And they settled on the islands in the Caribbean, and we're going back as far as 600 AD. They were called Taino, that's T-A-N-I-N-O, Indians, and they were an Arawak culture. They arrived on the islands displacing most of the previous inhabitants. This is an interesting note, the final Arawakian migrants were called Caribs. So you can hence to see where Caribbean became known. And they ended up moving into the Lesser Antilles around the 12th century. There were two big villages by the late 16th century, and the Torino people called the islands Keya, which in English means Mother of All Islands, and Haiti. Okay, now think Haiti. Land of high mountains, because Haiti is the English word for it. Now, some of our DR friends that do speak some Spanish, they all know that the H is almost always silent. So the Spanish name for Haiti is actually Haiti. So you're getting to understand where that came. Once again, it means land of high mountains. And by the time Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492, the country was divided into 5 sections or states, but they were called chiefdoms. And their names were Marilén, Meagua, Marawana, Jaragua, and Igi. Okay. Around from Columbus's time all the way up through 1795 is really when the Spanish arrived. And on his first voyage, it was December in 1492. The second voyage was a year later in 93. And they set up a colony in Santo Domingo, which is the capital of the city, and remains the oldest continuously inhabited European city in the Americas. So that's where the capital of Santo Domingo got started. And in the 16th century, the Taino kind of took part in and became into the African enslavement. Hundreds of thousands of Tainos living on the island were enslaved, and they were actually working in gold mines. Yes, the DR is very healthy, endowed in gold, copper, nickel, silver, and many other precious commodities. But they were forced, into near extinction due to hunger, disease, mass killings. By around 1535, there was slightly over 60,000 remaining. The Spanish monarchs under Fernandez I and Queen Isabella, they granted permission to the colonists in the Caribbean to import more African slaves, which began arriving around the 1503 era. These African importees had the most dominant racial influence, and their rich and ancient culture still remains quite intact here. A strong influence, second only to that of Europe, on political culture and character of modern Dominican Republic. Around the 17th century, the French started to approach the island, and in 1605, the King and Queen of Spain became just furious when they found out that all of the Spanish settlements on the north and western coasts of the island were carrying out a large-scale illegal trade with the Dutch. Now, the Dutch at that time were fighting a war of independence against Spain. And the English became a very recent enemy of the state as well. So they decided to forcibly resettle their inhabitants, all of them, closer to the main city of Santo Domingo. This action was known as the Devastaciones de Osario, and it proved to be disastrous for more than half of the resettled colonists died of starvation and disease, and well over 100,000 head of cattle were abandoned, and many of the slaves at that point in history did escape and gain their freedom, which went on to become small-scale farmers and landowners. In the 18th century, the colonial decline in the Haitian Revolution, it was known as the House of Bourbon, and it was replaced by the House of Habsburg in Spain around 1700, and it introduced reforms that they had no choice but to really begin to revive the trade in Santo Domingo. So the King and Queen of Spain reluctantly had to relax the rigid controls and the restrictions on commerce between Spain and the colonies and amongst the other colonies. So there was kind of like a forced regime. There was no way of stopping it. And the last of these flotillas sailed in 1737. This was what was known as a monopoly port at that time, and that was abolished and made it a free trade port with other countries. And by the middle of that century, the population was actually flourishing by immigration from various people from the Canary Islands, and all other parts of the world were starting to settle in. They plant tobacco in the Cibao Valley, which to this day is one of the biggest producers of cigar tobacco. And they started to import slaves again, and that renewed. The population of Santo Domingo grew from roughly 6,000 people to well over 125,000 by 1790. So that's about a 60-year chain of events there. That's a tremendous amount. And of this number, about 40,000 were actually white landowners, and 25,000 were black, or what's called mulatto, freedmen. They were freed slaves, and they had same rights as the white people. And there were about 65,000 of that gained population were actually slaves. However, though, the whole region did remain in a poor and still fairly neglected state. In about 1795, the French arrived to the island. Of course, you know, the French then eventually went on to take over Haiti, but in 1795 they arrived, and by 1801, Les Ouvertures arrived in Santo Domingo, proclaiming the abolishment of slavery on behalf of the French Republic. Not too long after that, the General Napoleon dispatched an army which subdued the whole island and ruled it for only a few months. The mulattoes and the blacks rose up against these French in October around 1802 and finally did defeat them in November of 1803. On New Year's in 1804, the victors declared Saint Dominique to be the independent Republic of Haiti, or Haiti as we call it. The Haitian occupation ran from about 1821 to about 1845. This 23-year Haitian occupation that followed is called by Dominicans as a period of brutal military rule. Though the truth of it is it was far more complex, but that's just how they viewed it. It led to large-scale land seizures and failed efforts to, force productions of export crops. They imposed military services and sanctions, restricted the use of Spanish language, and eliminated many of their local sports and cultures, such as cockfighting and their local, just everything about themselves they tried to take away from them. It did reinforce, though, the Dominicans' perceptions of themselves as being completely different from Haitians in everything from language, race, religion, domestic customs. But it was also a period that definitively ended slavery as an institution in the eastern part of the island. What a lot of people don't know is, though, Haiti's constitution forbid whites from owning land. And the major landowning families that were from the previous era were actually forcibly deprived of their properties. Now, most of these people immigrated to the Spanish colonies at that time of Cuba and Puerto Rico. Hence, where over the generations their skin tone started to lighten because of the mixing of these whites with the local people. The independence of the DR, though, took parallel over several periods, the first of which was in 1844 and ran to about 1861. On July 16th in 1838, a very famous name you'll see all over. Every city's got streets. The main highway is named after him. Juan Pablo Duarte. So you're going to find Duarte is a very, very popular name in the country. He, along with several of his supporters, founded a secret society they called La Trinitaria. And they did win independence from Haiti. Now, the First Republic, the Dominican's first constitution was adopted on November 6th of 1844, and it did feature a presidential form of government with a lot of liberal tendencies. It was very democratic, but it was marred by one particular article they called Article 210, and that was imposed by Pedro Santana on the Constitution Assembly by force, giving him the privileges, much the same as a dictator, until this war of independence was over. After that, it did switch into a democratic form of government for a period of time.